Come gather round people wherever you roam and admit that the waters around you have grown. You better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Words by
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan. Immortal words by Bob Dylan, which it kind of encapsulates what we're going to talk about today, how times have changed over generations, particularly when it comes to faith. Today I'm joined by the one and only Dad, otherwise known as Pastor Peter Prothero, or P3 for those who are very familiar. Yeah. So good to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here, son.
Yeah. Well, today, the title today is Two Generations of Faith. And I thought we could dive into how faith has changed and how ministry has changed and how church has changed over the years through your life and my life. And we'll just deep dive in and see where it takes us.
Great.
You had a good morning?
It was a good morning. Coffee and a croissant filled with pistachio. I'm set.
Let no one say your son doesn't take care of you.
even though I paid.
That's the first thing he's paid for all week. All right. Well, I'm just going to dive in with a couple of questions. So first off, do you think Christians today worry about different things than your generation did? Like, what were the set of things that your generation were really concerned about spiritually in church? And, I kind of think, do we just cycle over the same worries again and again? There's nothing new under the sun. Or do things really shift and move, or is it cyclical? What's your take on it? What are things that in your age people are really concerned about that actually we've kind of dealt with maybe? And today, what are you seeing some of the differences in?
Yeah. Well, I think in my time, one of the biggest issues that people were facing was nuclear war. It was a huge angst worldwide.
Yeah.
Because there was the whole thing, the tension between Russia and America, and what we were told was the nuclear arms race. That's what we were told. And so there was an anxiety in the whole of culture when I was we're talking 50 years ago now. Is the world going to end? And how will it end? And so eschatology, Hal Lindsey wrote Late Great Planet Earth. Yeah. So everyone at that time in the 70s was really interested in eschatology, Jesus coming back again, when is that going to happen? And the state of the world, the angst that was in the world because of the uncertainty. And so what I experienced in my 20s was, we don't know how long we've got. Let's sell everything.
How'd that work out?
Don't worry about a pension. Don't worry about the future. Let's just get on with mission. Let's just get on with spreading the gospel. And there was a kind of a carefree attitude towards things that today we might consider to be much more responsible. And it wasn't that we were irresponsible, although looking back, some people might put that label on it. It's just that there was such a deep sense of, we don't know how long we've got, let's just get on with the job and trust God for everything.
Which isn't bad in its essence. There's something very faith-filled about that.
It was definitely faith-filled, if not a little naive.
Yeah.
And we were asking a different set of questions. And I think as time has gone on, there is a definite different angst. I think we were more secure in our identity, and I think the biggest cultural shift I've seen is that people are asking questions that were givens, biologically given, about sexual identity, for instance. And now, since postmodernism has come in and really got a grip within many of Western cultures, there's a deep sense of angst about who am I and where do I fit. And I think the other shift that I've seen is that things were more black and white in my 20s, and today things are much more gray, so that the Z generation seem to be able to hold contradictory views on things.
Quite comfortably.
Yes, comfortably. And I don't think ask deep enough questions to see why are you comfortable living with two things that are actually quite contradictory if you really dig deep. So I think that's one of the biggest shifts. It's the same anxiety, but over a different issue.
Right. So the anxiety remains, but the issues fluctuate and shift.
Yeah. And I think identity and belonging are two big cultural anxiety issues today.
Well, it becomes impossible. I mean, in a culture where the word self-evident no longer is a phrase that works in our context, post-truth culture is what we call it. It would make sense that the first thing to slip would be a sense of footing, foundation, and identity. The things that were self-evidential, apparently I can't trust that anymore. I can't trust my instincts. I can't trust my intuition. I can't trust my eyesight. I can't trust basic biology anymore, or just basic science. Kind of goes out the window with some of these new modern philosophies. It would make sense that identity becomes a thing that comes under attack.
Totally. And then the other thing that I think that I've seen is there's a greater hunger today than there was in the 70s and 80s when I was being discipled, even when I was pastoring, that today the whole secular philosophy has left people empty. The whole thing about making money, achieving, that was very prevalent in the 80s and 90s with financial collapses taking place and everything. People are realizing that secularism is not meeting their fundamental need. And there's now an awakening that there is a dimension to life that is intangible. We would call it spiritual. And people are starting to hunger and connect with that and be much more open to that. And I think that's a major shift. So even though there's a greater sense of angst going on and a greater sense of confusion about identity, at the same time, people are not buying into the secularism philosophy and the postmodern philosophy of the past. They're not buying into it to the same degree.
Yeah, because I suppose with an older generation, in a post-World War II, Cold War, apocalyptic sort of mindset, as destructive as that can be, there's a unifying aspect to that as well.
Yeah.
We're all on mission. There's a faith aspect. So that there's a real sense of identity. We know who we are. We know what we're for.
Yeah. And so in that sense, that enabled our generation to overcome that angst that was in the world. We had a peace that God was in control, and that end time events, no matter how bad they were an unfolding of God's plan that would lead to the second coming.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of the rapture and escapism was very prevalent at that time.
Yeah.
And so it's like, we're going to be okay.
Yes, yeah. And there's still, there's still a generation of people working through that. It's not like that's been solved, but it's much, you can almost draw a line between the age of people who still have that sort of mentality that there's kind of the left behind generation.
Yeah. Exactly.
But young people don't tend to worry about that at all.
No.
But then nihilism comes from a different place, I find, with young people, like AI, for example. When young people are thinking about how am I going to get a job in 10, 20 years when AI has taken over everything, where is my meaning? Where is my sense of worth? Where do I fit in the community? What's the point of life? It's really, I find young people, like you said, really struggle finding their fit within community, and how that's going to play out in the long term.
Yeah. And we were in a meeting last night where a young man asked the question, what's the meaning of life?
Yeah, kind of facetiously, but he stared you down and kind of wanted an answer, didn't he?
He did. And then we talked afterwards.
Yeah.
And he said, I was being a bit naughty, but I'm also being a bit serious. I want to know what you really think about that, which I found fascinating. And I said, well, here's my starting point, the John 17. But then he wanted to go dive deeper into that. And where he was coming from was, how do we connect with the community to have a narrative and an understanding of life that is not just a subjective thing? And then I was able to say to him, that's a great way of looking at it, because I think the first community we have to be indebted to is the community in history. In other words, the church has wrestled with a number of issues over literally 2,000 years, and we can't just ignore that. We might disagree, we might have a different view, but at least we have to understand that view before we change it. We have to understand where it's coming from. And so there's so much biblical illiteracy today that the givens that I grew up with are no longer there. You know, when I talk about a Bible story sometimes to people, they don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah. You know, David and Goliath and Samson, and they go, "Oh yeah, where's that?" It's like,
is that in the book of David?
Yeah, and so you realize, okay, there's not the framework here. There's not even the framework to be talking about some things. You cannot make the same set of assumptions that you did in the 70s today with people. There's got to be much more unpacking. It has to be much more simple. And you have to speak to the angst of this generation, which is the kind of questions you ask. With AI on the scene, where do I fit? And I think that comes to pastors and leaders helping people understand that everybody has a calling, has a vocation, has a gifting in God that AI cannot replace.
Right. Because in secular culture, so much of our meaning has come through our vocation. Yeah. And that's where we've situated. That's how we add value to society and we feel meaningful. Yeah. But if that's stripped away from you, you know, where does true meaning come from? And I think for a lot of young people that's the sentiment. What's the meaning? Yeah. What's my point? Why am I going to university if in 10 years I'm obsolete?
Yes, and I think people like Scott Galloway, he is so pragmatic. He's very much come against the narrative, follow your heart.
Yes, yeah.
You know, he says that's just going to lead you to unemployment.
You'll be a happy poor artist or something.
He takes a very pragmatic approach, and he says you just need to look at the culture, look at where the gaps are, and then learn a craft that fills that gap. And if you go right back to biblical times, young men started working with their fathers around about 12 years of age. When the disciples met Jesus, they'd been in the trade of fishing for at least 9 years. I mean, we know that they were teenagers or early 20s.
Yes, yeah.
But we forget they would have been in that craft. And even the Apostle Paul, who's highly intellectual, he's on the level of any Greek philosopher that you could find intellectually. But Paul is a worker of leather. We call it a tent maker, but actually if you look at the Greek, a worker of leather. So he could repair saddles, he could repair tents, he could repair anything made of leather.
Shoes, all kinds of, yeah.
Yeah, so he had this basic skill that enabled him to be highly mobile and highly versatile and highly self-sufficient when he needed to be. And I think we've lost the vocational aspect of being pragmatic, learning a skill. And one of the things quite serendipitously for me was when I went into ministry in the church, you know, I did all kinds of jobs, but one of the things I ended up doing was starting a company for printing. And I began a print and design company with a friend. And we used all the equipment that was owned by the church but was not being used. And I said, well, if I start a company, can I use this? And I'll print at cost price and everything. And that was a completely pragmatic decision. I didn't feel called to printing.
Yes, yeah.
I had a young family. I wanted to provide. And I thought, well, I had an engineering mind. I can learn this skill. So I knew my calling was in ministry and teaching and pastoring. But at the same time, I had this skill set that provided for me. And I never felt like I was compromising one. I just thought, well, it's hand in glove. It just goes together. And I have to decide how much time I put into one and how much time I put into another. And that was just a stewardship issue from my perspective. And I think today, people feel like, well, here's the issue I'm wrestling when I talk to young leaders. they have a calling on their life and they expect the church to provide everything. And I say, it doesn't quite work like that. You're a young leader. You've got no track record. You have a calling. We'll pay you 2 days a week and find 3 days doing something else where you can earn money, which is a huge challenge. And I get it's a big ask, but I think it develops something in people. I think it develops character, self-sufficiency, resource, thinking outside the box. And I sense younger leaders today are really wrestling with the whole entitlement issue. And I don't think it's their fault.
Every generation has said that about the younger generation, though. I mean, going back to Socrates, Socrates said it of Plato, and you can go through. They're so entitled and they're so lazy, and they don't. Is that an issue of generations getting worse, or that's just young people in general have this
I think it's
sense of,
young people.
Yeah.
I don't view people who have a sense of entitlement as lazy. I view it as nothing is handed to you on a plate.
Yeah.
And I think the other issue I've observed is there's been a shift towards more professionalism in ministry, where instead of people grounding themselves in their calling and asking God, where do you want me to serve? It's more, where is there an opportunity where I can earn and fulfill my calling?
Mm.
And so that's another shift I think I've seen, where people are very quick to sort of say, there's an opportunity here, I'm moving. Mm-hmm. Almost like an ambition thing, almost like a promotion thing.
Well, it's sort of the age of the entrepreneur, isn't it? I mean, everybody who isn't setting up a business or, that's what TikTok is. It's just released entrepreneurs and the mindset of entrepreneurs, and they are who are influencing young people. And so there's that sense of like, I can start something and run something and become professional and become successful.
Yeah. Whereas my generation, that wasn't big in our thinking.
No, nobody wanted to become a CEO in the 80s. Being a CEO was kind of geeky.
Yeah.
Now it's the coolest job you can have.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how well that's really served us in the church, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it's made us too corporate in the church. Too corporate in the way we deal with people.
Well, that's true. Maintaining professionalism versus that sort of relational ministry nature is very difficult.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I think, young people, when I talk to them as well, I feel like they're, because what we're seeing, let me backtrack. What we're seeing now is, Bible sales globally are through the roof, and it's predominantly generated and driven by Gen Z and
Definitely.
Young people coming back to buying a Bible. And like you said, I think we've lived in a culture now that has eaten the fruit of secularism for so long, feels lost at home. They're still living in the basement at 27 years old with a master's degree of their mum and dad's, and they're kind of lost and looking, where is truth now? And I always tell young people, like, if only there was a teacher who was a conduit of truth, who called himself the truth, and could give us a pathway. If only that was written down for us somewhere, someone we could lay out principles for life. And I think young people are cottoning onto that at the moment, and they're looking for sort of this sense of foundation because, it's definitely a shift in mind, but they're not concerned about the end of the world. That's one thing I never get a question about from anybody under the age of 30.
Yeah. I think the other shift that I've seen is, I grew up in the 60s and 70s where feminism, people like Germaine Greer had written The Female Eunuch, and second wave feminism was really gaining momentum. The pill was invented in the 60s.
Yeah.
So that it brought this kind of, with the hippie revolution, it brought this sexual freedom. It brought women into a place of independence. And at the time, they thought it was bringing them into freedom. Actually, I think looking back, it brought them into conflict, because now there were choices about, I can choose and have freedom with partners. I can choose and have freedom with vocation, and I can pursue a career. I don't have to be a wife. I don't have to be a mother. And I think the downside of that second wave feminism was a despising of motherhood and a despising of of seeing motherhood as work and as a vocation and as something that had value. And fast forward now to today, and the research is unequivocal that the greatest problems in society stem from single parent families. And there's some single parents who do a great job, and there's some parents who do a bad job, when there's a mother and a father. But the overall framework and picture is when there's a mother and father in a stable home, kids do better. And so again, that goes right back to the 60s and 70s. And now, like you said, we've eaten the fruit of that. And all it's done is now, instead of being a one-income family that could sustain a family, everything has increased. The markets have increased. Housing has increased. And now you have to be two people working to achieve what you could achieve in the 50s and 60s and 70s even. Now it's an obligation. What was an option is now an obligation. And I think that puts tremendous pressure. And I think in that season as well, there's been such an attack on men in terms of their identity. And I think people like Scott Galloway and people like Jordan Peterson are starting to address those issues and to try and restore a sense of dignity to men and the need for men. And third wave feminism has really attacked that. And so you've got people like Professor Palea, who is an atheist and a third wave feminist and everything, but she says feminism today has become toxic in the way it attacks men. And I think we see that in the confusion of identity now.
Yes, yeah.
Roles in the 50s and 60s were very clear. Men went out to work, they were breadwinners. Women looked after families. There was a sort of transition that started to take place, but men were still the primary wage earners. Now, third wave feminism is declaring we don't need men.
Yeah.
And it's like...
And it's, I'm all for feminism if feminism means lifting women up. I'm not for feminism if it means, pulling men through the mud.
Yes.
In order to sort of gain an equal foothold.
Well, that's where Camille Paglia has just critiqued the feminist movement, third wave feminism, and she says it's gone too far.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that feeds into the angst, particularly of younger men. So between the ages of 14 and 19, young men are twice as likely to commit suicide as girls. Between the ages of 19 and 24, they're 4 times as likely to commit suicide than girls. So I think there's something about young men today and what they're carrying and what they're trying to deal with that's really a huge issue, I think, in the church. So in the UK, the sale of Bibles has risen by 89%.
Wow.
That's just an astonishing statistic.
It is.
And the greatest engagement in the church now is between the ages of 16 and 24, that age where it's 4 times as likely to commit suicide. Actually, I think it might even be 5 times as likely. So I think there have been different shifts in terms of what the issues are, but the anxiety is the same. It's just a different cause, different issue.
Well, that's certainly played out anecdotally and in my life. You and Mum raised 6 kids on one income.
We did.
And a pastor's income. But that was still possible. It doesn't necessarily, we didn't live in a mansion or anything with a pool, but it was still doable. And now, me and Amanda with no kids, we both have to work. Yeah. We have to think very hard about how do we save up, how are we going to father and mother children, how are we going to parent children and share that responsibility, because the option for the women to go into the workplace, like you said, has now become an obligation. And it's so funny, isn't it? Because we always want what we don't have. And so whatever's not an option to us, we'll fight for that. But then when it becomes an obligation to us, all of a sudden it becomes this sort of mill around our neck that we have to do. And you're right. Young men are just not doing well at the moment. They're more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to be jobless and unemployed, more likely to become addicts, drug addicts. And it's that sense of identity that men are hardwired to want to provide and to wrestle. And by wrestle, I'm not talking, I mean, wrestle with the world and wrestle with challenges and solve problems and to fight. Like, that's a guy thing. My sister, your daughter, Emma, she's got 3 boys, and the first thing they want to do is wrestle you. It's hardwired into us. And I think that's true spiritually as well. But that culturally has played out and affected the church massively. Well, how have you seen that affect like men in leadership and women in leadership? Because there's great benefits to women being more empowered. We've seen a huge shift culturally with female leadership and female speakers, and just the release of women in ministry. And I'm talking about public platform. It's not just women you can speak at the women's conference. There are women starting unbelievable ministries that are empowered to do that and run large corporations and all kinds of stuff. But that is a shift that's happened only in the last 40 years or so. So there's been real positives as well to that over the years.
Yeah, I think it is a huge positive. I've championed women in leadership, over 25 years.
Well, you were early on that.
I was, very. I mean, our Bible college in Denmark, we literally had women coming to the Bible college, and I don't want to name Bible colleges. I could name them, but they're known worldwide. And they said, we're coming here because we're allowed to wear jeans.
Right.
If they went to this other Bible college, they had to wear a skirt or a dress. There was a dress code for women. And there was a very clear understanding that, we'll train you, but don't have any expectation of taking on a significant leadership role within the church.
Yeah.
So I saw that early on. The one thing I would say about all of that is the statistics show us that by the time women are in their early 30s, up until about 35, no matter how successful they are in whatever vocation they're serving in, they realize that there's a window of opportunity to have children. Mm-hmm. There's a famous book that was written called Eggs Are Expensive and Sperm is Cheap. Because a woman has a cycle when she starts ovulating, when she starts her period as a young teenager until she's around about 50, and she stops. She has menopause. So there's a window for a woman. That's not the same for a man. Right. Abraham is going till he's 120. It's like
sure.
And so around about 35, women are realizing, okay, now I have to make a decision. Am I going to pursue a career at the cost of not having a family? Or do I want to bail out now? And that's why there are so many over 35, 40, there are so many more senior executives who are men. It's not because there's a glass ceiling for women, it's because women are choosing to say, no, I've had a career, now I want a family.
Yeah. And
it's much more critical, the choices they make. And so I think in the church, what we've got to do is be clear up front with young women. Consider this.
Right. Yeah. Because like you said, motherhood became so despised and disparaged, looked down upon as though you were less intelligent, less ambitious. You were just slipping into the cultural norms and pressures of today, of today's society. And it's really been belittled. But I'm just seeing, I don't know if you sense this, I'm seeing it's just a slight pendulum swing where, like you said, women are, really considering, really honoring the role of motherhood again. And which should, of course, be honored. Paul says, fulfill your ministry. And if your ministry is to be a mother, then there's nothing wrong with that. The issue is whether you want it. Wanting it is one thing, being able to afford it now in our culture. I just think there's a cultural pressure. And it's so expensive, like the cost, the financial breakdown, practical cost of choosing motherhood over a career.
Yeah.
There's more pressure, I think, on women now to pursue the career over motherhood.
Yeah. The research that's coming out now is quite astonishing. I forget her name now, but there's a wonderful woman has been doing research with children between newborns up until the age of 3. And her research has proven that a mother needs to be present with a child, significantly present, not putting the child into childcare. She says putting children into childcare under the age of 3 has been the worst thing we've ever done, because it creates within the child a lack of bonding, and it builds into their whole neurology an anxiety that they very rarely are able to overcome. It's fascinating, the research that she's done.
Yeah.
And so I was with a group of young Christian feminists. This is many years ago now. And they were telling me about all the things they're going to do and all the things they're going to achieve in ministry and and I'm going to have a family. And I say, okay, what are you going to do when you have a family? I'm going to put my child into childcare and I'm going to carry on with ministry. And I said, okay, just imagine that you're Mary and you're going to give birth to Jesus. You're going to put him into childcare.
Yeah.
What's been entrusted to you, you're now going to give to someone else and get on with the real ministry.
Yeah.
And it caused a storm,
Right.
the backlash I got from these women. How dare you say that? How dare you present me with that? And I said, look, I'm just trying to get you to think and to place a value on children and on the family and on what you've been given to steward, that there's value in this. It is an equal vocation. And I don't think it's something you can just delegate and give away as though church work is more important than family work. To me, the two are meant to intersect and blend, and work together.
Yeah. I don't. It was years ago I heard it. A pastor said, your first and primary church is your family.
Yeah.
And don't separate out the meeting on Sunday from your family, as in don't assume that the meeting on Sunday is church and your family isn't.
Yeah, Paul, when he writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy 3, and he's listing the qualifications of an elder, of a leader, a bishop.
Yes, yeah.
One of the, you can sort of split it up to what's his reputation outside? How do people view him? What do they say about him? Is his life, he begins by saying, is it above reproach? Mm-hmm. In other words, is anything sticking that just makes you think this is not right? But then he goes inside and he said, what's his family like? What's his family like? Is he a drunkard? Is he short-tempered? Are his children submissive? What kind of inner world has he built within the family? And then Paul is very clear. If he doesn't know how to rule his own house, how can he rule the house of God? In other words, if he's not giving guidance and leadership to his family, how can he give guidance and leadership to the church? And then Paul goes on to say, lastly, not a novice, lest he's puffed up, with the pride of the devil. So, in other words, there has to be a bit of a track record here.
Yeah.
And so they're the things I think we need to look for when we're looking for any kind of leadership role.
Yeah, yeah.
That it's not just about charisma and gifting, but it's about character. And that takes time to develop.
Yeah, yeah. And that, it's time is the key thing, I think, with any large cultural shift or church philosophical shift. It just takes a generation before you see how is this fruit going to play out. It takes 20 years of, putting kids into childcare to see the social science and what comes out of it. And it's such a slow game we play sometimes. And it's just, it's like a large ship. It just, you have to move it so slowly, and make these course corrections as you go. Are you optimistic about the trajectory of what you've seen the church go through in your lifetime and what you see for the future? Do you see it moving forward? Or do you see it in some areas? Yeah, but in some areas it just regresses. Just your take. Are you optimistic about how the church has changed over time? or are you very English and pessimistic about it?
I think overall I'm optimistic because I'm deeply grounded in Jesus' words in Matthew 16, I will build my church. So I have a deep sense that the church Jesus is after is going to emerge. And I'm very optimistic in that sense. At the same time, I think a lot of what we see around the world that's called church needs a bit of deconstructing. It's like we've created too much of a personality cult in the pulpit. And I think that's to the detriment of those men that we've seen fall one after another, and to the detriment of the church. And I think it's right there in Corinth when they're saying, I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Peter, I'm of Paul, and I'm of Apollos. There is this human tendency to want to exalt a particular leader and identify with their style and their personality and their charisma. And Paul calls that carnality. So there's a lot about the church that I just think, oh man, this is not helping us. But overall, I'm tremendously optimistic. And when I hear about the stats of young people seeking, and I see the engagement, and even in our own church, we're seeing people come to faith weekly. We're seeing prodigals return who've been disconnected from church and finding fresh life and fresh faith. So overall, I am really optimistic.
Yeah.
But I'm not naive about some of the shifts and changes that need to take place in the church.
Do you think some countries are doing better than others?
Yes, I do. I think countries where the church is persecuted, there seems to be a purity of faith that I find very inspiring.
It is. It's a phenomenon that is so. It feels so counterintuitive that the more somebody goes through pain, suffering, and persecution, the more they tend to become Christ-like and soften and understand humility and servanthood and so many of these things that are really tough for a wealthy culture to grasp.
Yeah. And, you know, a verse like "take up your cross daily," they understand.
They get it. They have to. Yeah. It's not a choice they have to make. I mean, it's a part of their reality in their world.
Yeah. And for them, their faith might actually cost them their life. And so they think deeply. And they encounter deeply. And so I'm very inspired by that level of purity of faith. And I find it very humbling when I'm around people like that. I want to get low.
Yeah.
I want to speak less and hear more when I'm around people like that.
Yeah, they're sort of stripped of all of the unnecessaries and you know, when you don't have wealth, I've nothing against smoke or lights or stages or nice buildings, but when you're stripped of all that opportunity, you're really left with the bare essence of faith and community and relationship, those things that really matter.
Yeah. And you've got to know that as a leader. You've got to know that. You've got to know that the lights and all that stuff is just the razzmatazz, and that's okay.
Yeah.
When we have a party, we buy balloons and we streamers and we light candles and all of that. That's the razzmatazz. But the real issue is when you have a party, a birthday party, you're honoring the person who's having a birthday. That's
the essence of it. Yeah.
And I think worship is like that. I don't mind the razzmatazz as long as we don't lose sight of the heart of it. It's about Jesus being central and him being honored and worshipped.
Yeah. Despite all the cultural shifts, what do you think about following Jesus that hasn't changed at all?
Yeah. Well, I think spiritual formation comes down to simple disciplines that we learn to embrace in the same way that we embrace eating and exercise and sleep as healthy patterns of living. So the simplicity of reading the Bible, not just a promise box verse. I think I'd like to throw out every promise box in the world if I could, because it so removes the text from the context and from
you just sort of end up with sound bites, don't
intention.
you? Yeah, right.
It becomes a sound bite.
Right.
Just to get people reading a book of the Bible, or reading the Bible regularly, learning to pray, learning to spend time in God's presence in the way Jesus did.
Yeah. It comes back down to these basic spiritual practices that are just perennial and have lasted, prayer, Sabbath, even solitude and silence with God, meditation, fasting, the basics.
If you look at Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this. He says, when you fast, he doesn't say if you fast.
Right, there's just an assumption.
It's an assumption. Hey, when you fast, don't be like the guys on the streets who just make themselves look ugly and let you know that their life is miserable right now while they're fasting. Anoint your head with oil and just don't let anyone know.
Right.
Don't do it to be seen by men, but do it to be seen by your Father in heaven, who will reward you. If you do it to be seen by men, you've had your reward. So I think there's a Christianity that is showy Christianity, that it's about, I've done all the outward things. And I'm actually facing that in the particular context I'm in right now, where people view going to church on Sunday as it. I've done my church thing. Now I'm doing my secular job, or I'm doing whatever. And I'm saying, actually, no, this Sunday thing is trying to set you up and influence what you're like on Monday and who you are on Monday. And so Jesus says, when you pray, go into your closet, pray to your Father in secret. Your Father will reward you openly. And so there's this, and then when you give. And so these are things. So am I giving? Am I fasting? Am I praying? And am I doing it to be seen by my Father in heaven? Or am I doing it because I want to be seen to be doing it? I want to be seen to be the spiritual person or whatever. So I think spiritual formation comes about with embracing certain disciplines, not in a legalistic way, but in a life-giving way that feeds my soul. So we just introduced fasting this year to our church. I don't think our church has fasted for like 5 years. So we just introduced corporate fasting. And I just simply said to people, hey, if you just want to begin by missing one meal a day, you're winning. You've achieved something. And then to those of you who do fast, I said, just go one step further. In other words, if you fasted for 3 days, do it for 4.
Right. If
you fasted one meal, try fasting 2. Just try and push yourself to go a little bit further and see what that does for you. And so I'm not trying to say to people, this is what you have to do. I'm inviting them to take a further step in their walk with the Lord.
Yeah.
And to then see, well, what has that produced in your life? Is there testimony that comes out of that? Do you feel like somehow you've grown and matured in that? So I don't think you can ever substitute those things.
Yeah, those basic spiritual formation practices just still work. Have you ever read that book? I'm forgetting the name of it. It's called something akin to Luke Skywalker Can't Read. Have you ever read that book? It's a series of essays. But the basic thesis is that if you watch the original trilogy, if you watch the later ones, it actually disproves this. But if you watch the original trilogy, nowhere in the whole series of movies does Luke Skywalker ever read anything. and so the thesis is as we become more technologically advanced, we become more illiterate. And it goes into this idea, and I think the principle is true with church, that the wealthier we become, the more affluent we become, the more tech savvy we become, the more the basics become illiterate. By basics, I mean the principles that you're talking about that have just been true forever.
Yeah,
And
we have a whole generation now raised on social media.
Yeah, and sound bites.
And now, again, the research has come in. It hasn't helped them. It's created more anxiety. And so lots of educational institutions now are getting rid of computers. What we thought was helping education, now people are less intelligent, less literate.
Right.
Less able to cope with life, less able to cope with stress. People's resilience in that younger generation is so low. And just the simple discipline of reading.
Yes, yeah.
Of just being quiet.
Well, it's changed my life. You know me, I'm not a good focuser. You've seen all my school report cards. You saw all my grades in school. I didn't read a book until I was 14 and read Harry Potter. I think Mum had it laying on the windowsill for 3 years before I finally picked it up out of sheer boredom. Yeah. But the last 2 years, that's been my discipline, is going back to reading, and I wish I could describe to people the freedom I feel like my mind has had, my brain has had. And I mean reading scripture, not just scripture, but just great thinkers. Scott Galloway, Notes on How to Become a Man or Being a Man. Fantastic book. Every young person should read that. Every old person should read that. Everyone should read that, men or women. People who challenge me. And like you said, it's the basic discipline of just cutting stuff out and going back to reading. But I think people would experience this with every spiritual discipline if they gave themselves the time and the bandwidth in their day to simply create space to be formed in that way. Two final questions for you. If you could say one thing to young people, what would you tell them? And vice versa, if you could say something to your generation. So if you could speak to my generation and younger,
right,
what would you tell them? If you could say something to your generation, the church, and older, what is it you would like to see?
Yeah. I think to the younger generation, I would say, take time to build a Sabbath into your lifestyle where you disconnect from technology and you learn to be quiet. You learn to go for a walk and think, and you take time reading. I think there's so much that young people, they're so bombarded that there has to be an intentional disconnect. And I think we're wired for that disconnect. We're wired for the Sabbath routine. And I don't mean it in a legalistic sense, but just in a sense of take a break from all this. I was really impressed when I heard Ben Shapiro say, who's Jewish, and he's a Sabbath observer as a Jew, but he turns off his computer and his mobile phone for 24 hours.
Right.
This is a guy with a global.
I mean, he lives. That's his whole job and career is built around media.
Exactly, and he takes 24 hours to do that. I think I'd say to the younger generation, it will be so good for your mental health, your emotional well-being, and your sense of personhood if you do that. And disconnecting and being quiet is not easy.
No, being in your own company can be dreadful.
Yeah. It's like, what do I do now? What do I do now?
That's the famous Jean-Paul Sartre line, isn't there? If you're bored in your own, if you're bored in your own company, you're in bad company.
That's a great line.
But it's hard to be comfortable with your own mind and thoughts, and I think a lot of people aren't. Like, we talked about identity a lot in this podcast. Yeah, your identity is your thoughts and your patterns. Be renewed. Yeah. It's about your mind, and so giving yourself room to breathe there.
And then the second thing I'd probably say to young people is, who are you looking up to that you want to emulate? Paul would often say in his writings, I want you to imitate me the way I imitate Christ. I am actually modeling something that's worth you following, that's worth you imitating. So I would say to young people, well, who are you emulating? Who in your heart are you looking up to? And do they fit any kind of biblical paradigm of somebody worth looking up to? And maybe you need to make a shift. Maybe you need to look at somebody who's living with a sense of success. And by success, I don't just mean success in a material sense of that word, but just success in terms of doing life well. And then if I was to speak to the older generation, I would say, allow young people to make their own mistakes because you made enough of them. Don't be so judgmental about a younger generation. And why don't you open your home to embrace that generation and create space for belonging and dialogue and meals? I think, when I was 22, I left home mainly because I was called to Bible college, but my parents at that time were unbelievers. And I remember other older people embraced me and welcomed me into their family context, not as an interloper, but as, hey, our home is open to you when you need to talk, when you need a meal, when you're wrestling with an issue. And I would say to an older generation, don't be obsessed with retirement and golf and your pleasure.
Yeah.
You have a history with God, and you have resource that they don't have, and you have wisdom that they lack. And I'd say to my generation, why don't you do some investing? Why don't you create a legacy in another generation? And take time to do that. Take time to do it. You remember that when I was leading in Surrey, the church there, we had an intern program, and part of the intern program was I asked several families, would you take this intern in for a year and give them breakfast and an evening meal, and we'll do the rest?
Yeah.
And the notion behind that was you can actually give these young people something, not just a bed to sleep in, and some embraced it really well and did fabulously, and others said, it's too disruptive for my life. I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
It was like, okay,
Yeah.
that's your choice, and I think they've missed out on something personally.
Yeah.
When you get older, you either get grumpy and become stubborn and very set in your ways, or you realize I've still got an opportunity here to serve, maybe much more in the background, but still have an influence that can be profound.
Brilliant. That's a good note to finish this on. That was great.
A little bit of wisdom.
Just a little bit. You did good, Dad. You did good. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this is getting you to think, challenging you in some areas of your life, and maybe send this to somebody. If you've seen this and you think, wow, that somebody needs to listen to this, send this to somebody. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed on the YouTube channel. Those 5 stars always help us. Look, we don't really care about 5 stars or accolades. It just helps us with the algorithm to reach more people with good wisdom. So if you can go ahead and do that, that would help us out. We're going to be back again. We're going to be recording another podcast, so we'll be back again another couple of weeks with some good wisdom for you. But otherwise, I pray that you have a blessed day. Go forth and prosper.